Native Bees, a selection from Bee Basics, An Introduction to Our Native Bees, by Beatrice Moisset and Stephen Buchman, and published by the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There are 4,000 species of native bees in the United States. The members of the 5 most common families, Apidae, Halictidae, Andrenidae, Megachilidae, and Coelhidae, can be found throughout the North American continent, from Canada and Alaska to warm and sunny Florida and Mexico, from forests to deserts, from remote wildernesses to gardens and backyards. Even the National Mall in the heart of our nation's capital sports a native bee fauna. Perhaps the only places where bees are absent are the high mountains. There is even a hardy little bee, the Arctic bumblebee, which lives within the Arctic Circle. The young queen begins raising her first brood while there is still frost on the ground. Sometimes she spends hours vibrating her flight muscles while pressed against her brood cells, covering and providing heat for her young. She even has a brood patch, a bare spot on her abdomen, to transfer heat to her babies, just like many birds do. This physical activity and the heat it produces warm the waxen brood cells, speeding the development of the larvae. Bumblebees and a few other insects are like warm-blooded animals. They can be powerhouses, producing energy by rapidly flexing their flight muscles. This intense effort requires a lot of fuel, so they depend upon the early flowering willows and maples to provide plentiful amounts of nectar. Finally, after spending long hours taking care of her initial brood, the busy young queen has to leave the nest in search of supplies for the family. Apidae, honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, squash bees, southeastern blueberry bees, and cuckoo bees. The family Apidae is the largest bee family and includes a wide variety of native bee species, and also the non-native honeybee. In fact, the name of the family comes from the Latin name for the honeybee, Apis. It includes all the bumblebees, carpenter bees, and some species of cuckoo bees. Stingless bees and orchid bees that are found in the tropics also belong to this family. Bumblebees. There are about 50 species of North American bumblebees. Many people are familiar with bumblebees. They are large, furry, and mostly black, with stripes of yellow, white, or even bright orange. Bumblebees have some things in common with honeybees. They are more sociable than most other native bees, forming colonies with one queen and many workers. However, bumblebee colonies are never as big or as long-lived as those of honeybees. Bumblebees are ground nesters, with most making their nests in an underground cavity, or in rare cases above ground, partly covered by thatch. The cavities they need for their nests are larger than those of solitary bees. So the first thing that a young queen does in the spring is to find an abandoned mouse nest or a similar burrow. Then she starts preparing it for her brood. She builds a few wax pots that she fills up with pollen and honey, and a larger cell for her brood. Once provisioned, the queen lays her eggs, laying no more than half a dozen at first. These eldest offspring are all sterile female workers. Once this brood is fully grown, the queen rarely leaves the nest again, and spends all her time laying more eggs, while the workers take care of all the activities in and out of the nest. The colony grows rapidly, and it can reach a population of a few hundred workers. The workers are usually smaller than the queen. It is after her first brood emerges that you will seldom observe large bumblebees foraging. Near the end of the summer the queen lays male eggs in addition to female ones. The females emerging at this time become queens, not sterile workers, and they soon mate with the males after emerging from the nest. All workers, male bumblebees, and the old queen die at the end of summer. The only survivors are the new queens, which have already mated. They find a secluded hideaway to spend the winter and go to sleep. Then, as winter gives way to spring and the willows begin to flower, the queens emerge and each will found a new colony. Bumblebees and honeybees both have pollen baskets, called corbiculae, on their hind legs. They are more specialized than the pollen baskets of other bees, which are called scopae. In honeybees and bumblebees, the tibial segment of the hind leg is flattened, with rows of long, strong hairs along the edges. The shape of these baskets allows them to pack pollen, mixed with some nectar and saliva, into a tight mass called a corbicular pellet, rather than the loose mass of pollen grains clinging to the hairs of the scopae of other bee species. A few species of bumblebee have become cuckoos, laying their eggs in the nests of other bumblebees. They have no need for workers or for pollen baskets. Bumblebees are so effective at pollinating tomatoes that their buzz pollination services are put to good use in large greenhouses that grow tomatoes year-round. All that is needed is a queen, a box for the nest, and a supply of sugar water, because tomatoes produce abundant pollen but no nectar. The bumblebees are free to come and go, but remain inside the greenhouse most of the time. Bumblebees and their pollination services are a key component in agriculture. They are important pollinators of some clovers, a forage crop for cattle. Carpenter bees. Carpenter bees are typically large and black. You may have trouble telling them apart from bumblebees, except for one very distinctive feature. Bumblebees are fuzzy all over, while the upper abdomen of carpenter bees is almost hairless, appearing glossy. Early in the spring, males prospect for promising courtship and mating sites, not because they plan to set up housekeeping, but because they know that such places will attract females. They patrol the territory zealously, chasing away other males that venture too close. In fact, sometimes they chase away almost anything that moves, including surprised human gardeners. Fortunately, they cannot sting. Only females have stingers. So there is nothing to fear, and you can let them be. Females have powerful mandibles and use them to excavate wide tunnel systems in which they build their nests, hence their common name of carpenter bee. Carpenter bees are not always well-behaved pollinators. Occasionally, when a flower has a long throat that places the nectar out of reach of its tongue, the carpenter bee uses her sharp mouth parts to cut a slit at the base of the flower where the nectar is stored. She then drinks the nectar without coming near the pollen-dispensing anthers or stigma of the flower. Thus, carpenter bees can be nectar robbers that cheat the flower instead of doing it a service in return for its nectar. Bumblebees are also capable of floral larceny. Look at the trumpet honeysuckles, horse mints, or abelias in your garden. You may find the telltale signs of these attacks, flowers with their throats slit by thirsty carpenter bees. Small carpenter bees in the genus Seratina are related to the larger carpenter bees, although you would never mistake them because of the size difference. They nest in pithy stems, such as blackberry brambles or roses, rather than digging their own. Squash bees. Squash bees, Peponopsis and Xenoglossa, pollinate flowers of squash, pumpkins, melons, and other cucurbits. Peponopsis squash bees are dependent only on the pollen cucurbits. Squash bees are about the same size and brownish coloration of honey bees. You can easily tell them apart by their behaviors when they are near flowers of these crops. Squash bees are fine-tuned to the daily rhythms of cucurbit flowers. They begin their work shift at or before dawn, when the flowers of these valuable crop plants are opening. They show no hesitation when approaching a squash flower, plunging right in, gathering pollen and or nectar, and quickly leaving. Honey bees, on the other hand, arrive later in the day, once the flowers are past their prime. They also take extra time hovering over flowers and visiting them with a slower foraging tempo. Even with honey bee hives nearby, it is estimated that squash bees do many times more pollination per flower per unit time than honey bees. Cucurbit crop growers are very aware of their value as pollinators. These bees often nest underground beneath the very plants they will pollinate. If you are one of those who pick up your own pumpkin to make a jack-o'-lantern, you will be walking over nests full of developing young squash bees. Southeastern blueberry bees. The southeastern blueberry bee, Hapropoda laboriosa, gets its common name from the fact that it forages primarily on blueberries, Vaccinium species. Its native range is the southeastern United States. Southeastern blueberry bees are only active for a few weeks each year. It just so happens that their active season coincides with when blueberries are in flower. Compared to honeybees, blueberry bees are faster and more efficient pollinators of blueberry flowers. The reason for this is that the anthers of the blueberry flower are tubular, with an opening pore only at one end. The southeastern blueberry bee attaches herself to the blueberry flower and vibrates her flight muscles very rapidly. Like shaking a salt shaker, pollen comes out of the opening of the anther and is collected by the southeastern blueberry bee. When she moves on to the next blueberry flower, her buzz pollination not only shakes out the pollen, but causes pollen clinging to her body to attach to the stigma and pollinates the flower. What is buzz pollination? Or, as pollination ecologists call it, sonication. Buzz pollination is the process where a bee attaches itself to a flower and rapidly vibrates its flight muscles. This rapid movement causes the entire flower to vibrate and loosens the pollen so as to flow out the openings in the anthers. Bumblebees use buzz pollination when pollinating tomato flowers. Other flowering plants that require buzz pollination include cranberries and blueberries, eggplants, and other plant species in the family Solanaceae. Honeybees do not buzz pollinate flowers. Cuckoo bees. One large group within the Apidae family, the Nomadinae, is made up exclusively of parasitic bees, the cuckoo bees. Nomada bees are usually red or yellow, sometimes with whitish markings. They have lost all the adaptations that serve to carry pollen, as they don't need to provision their young. They are nearly hairless and are wasp-like in general appearance. Many cuckoo bees parasitize the nests of bees in the family Andrenidae. They are often seen in early spring, flying low over bare ground, searching for the nests of potential hosts. Once a cuckoo bee locates a nest, she waits nearby ready to sneak in and lay an egg while the busy female and rightful owner of the nest leaves in search of food. In some species of cuckoo bees, the female kills the larva as part of the process of parasitizing the nest. The egg of the cuckoo bee develops rapidly and grows into a larva that kills and eats the resident host larva, in addition to the pollen and nectar food reserves inside the host cell. Megachilidae. This family contains mason bees and leafcutter bees. The females use leaves and or mud in their nest construction. Most of these bees nest in holes, either in wood or hollow twigs, but there are also a few that nest in the ground. There are a few species within this family that are not native to the United States, but that have been introduced either intentionally or unintentionally in this country. An interesting characteristic of the bees of this family is that they don't carry the pollen on their back legs, but on the underside of their abdomens. If you happen to see a bee about the size of a honey bee with a yellow belly dusted with pollen, you can be sure that it is a megachilid bee, although sometimes the color of the pollen it is carrying may be white. However, some megachilid bees carry such large yellow-orange loads of pollen that they look like flying Cheetos snacks coming in for a landing at their nests. The blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria, of the western United States, is being managed for the pollination of fruit trees, especially sweet cherries and almonds. Farmers are providing drilled boards as nesting sites. Already it is proving to be an excellent replacement for the beleaguered honey bee on a local, though not national, level. Much remains to be learned about convenient rearing and use of this beautiful blue bee. Halictidae, sweat bees. Some of the most beautiful bees belong to this family. With their shiny, metallic-colored bodies, these bees will capture your heart. Many are metallic green, but others have shades of color from blue to copper or gold, and sometimes even black. Most nest in the ground. Some are solitary, while others share the entrance to their nests. In most cases, that is all they share, and are not truly social. However, a few sweat bee species go a step further and show some division of labor in guarding the entrance to their homes and rearing their young. Usually they are sisters that originated from the same nest. Some species of sweat bees can be considered truly social, with a division of labor in which the mother and founder of the colony lays eggs while the daughters do all the other work. Some unusually attractive halictids, green, yellow, and black-striped Agapostamon species, are found throughout North America. One of the prettiest halictid bees is Agochelora pura. The name means the pure, magnificent green bee, found in the eastern United States. It has the peculiar habit of building her nest under the bark of a rotted log. She takes advantage of the loose, half-rotted material to make the housing, adding her own saliva and secretions to build an envelope for her eggs and accumulated pollen. She kneads the pollen into a number of little loaves shaped like tiles, which she then plasters on the inner wall of the brood chamber, and then lays an egg before sealing the cell completely. This precaution is necessary due to foraging ants and other predators that abound under loose bark. One interesting and commercially valuable halictid bee is the alkali bee, Nomia melanderi, of the western United States. As its name suggests, the alkali bee prefers to build its nest in alkaline soils. It often lives in dense aggregations, up to tens or hundreds of thousands of individuals. However, it is not social, since each female constructs her own burrows and tends to her own brood, but lives compatibly with and in close proximity to other alkali bees. The alkali bee is a very good pollinator of alfalfa, and some growers take advantage of its nesting habits to manage this species to a limited extent. They supply the appropriate terrain for the alkali bee's needs near alfalfa crops. The farmers even go so far as creating it artificially by using a tarp, covering it with clay, and watering it as needed to create nesting beds. Once established, these alkali bee beds can remain active for decades. There are also some cuckoo bee species in this family, and just like the other cuckoo bees, they are almost hairless and somewhat wasp-like. Some have a bright red abdomen. Andrenidae, minor bees. The Andrenid bees are all ground nesters, and thus the common name minor bees. They are mostly dark, black, or reddish, but they can be metallic blue, yellow, or red and yellow. They are often shy, medium to large-sized bees. They can be distinguished from other bees by the velvety patches, foveae, on their faces, between the eyes and the base of the antennae, though these patches are often visible only under a microscope. Many are active only in the early spring. The next generation remains underground, developing through the summer, fall, and winter, only to emerge the next spring when their favorite flowers are in bloom. What would eastern forests be without azaleas? Their flowers are one of our native flowering plants that honeybees cannot pollinate. They don't release their pollen like most flowers, but hold it inside the anthers, waiting for a skillful bee that knows how to shake it, just like a salt shaker. Further, the pollen clumps are tied together with sticky threads. Bumblebees and a number of solitary bees are good at pollinating azalea flowers. The Cornell azalea bee, Andrena cornelli, is one of them, a dark-colored slender bee that is found in the eastern United States. It is never too far from azaleas because their pollen is its favorite food. Her pollen baskets have long, widely spaced hairs that are especially adapted to the texture and size of these flowers' pollen clumps. Andrenids are among the earliest bees to emerge in the spring. You will observe them visiting willows, maples, violets, and other early blooming spring wildflowers. Some Andrenid bees are very good pollinators of apple blossoms. Coletidae. This is a small family of solitary bees, which is considered more primitive than other families of bees. Some of them, such as the yellow-masked bees, Hylaeus, do not have baskets in which to carry pollen. Instead, these bees carry pollen inside their crops. They are not as hairy as other bees and can easily be mistaken for wasps. They all nest in pithy stems. Sometimes they form large aggregations of closely spaced nests. They use a cellophane-like material exuded from glands to line the brood cells where they lay their eggs, so sometimes they are called cellophane bees. Bee mimics. Last but not least, there are superb impersonators of bees, the flower flies or syrphids. Don't be fooled by them. Despite their appearance, they are not bees, but flies. They are frequent flower visitors, and they don't have a stinger like most bees. They masquerade as bees to fool hungry birds. Often they succeed in fooling the inexperienced observer of bees as well. Bee flies, another family of bee mimics, are parasites of many bee species. All flies have only one pair of wings, as compared to the 2 pair of wings possessed by bees. This is a significant difference between flies and bees, but it is nearly impossible to notice when they are flying about. Part of the reason for this difficulty is that bees' wings have tiny hooks that lock the front and hind wings together, making them appear as just one on each side. There are several other differences that would be more helpful to the observer of these flower visitors. Bee flies and syrphid flies have huge eyes, very short antennae, and skinny legs when compared to bees. End of Native Bees. A selection from Bee Basics, An Introduction to Our Native Bees by Beatrice Moisset and Stephen Bushman, and published by the United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
Neither Dorking nor the Abbey by J. M. Barrie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Neither Dorking nor the Abbey by J. M. Barrie. Note: in England recently there died a great man, the greatest of his day. Immediately there arose much vain contention as to whether or no his dust should be given resting place among that of his peers in Westminster Abbey. Finally came the decision that Westminster was not to be so honoured, and the urn containing all of him that had outlived the fire was placed in the sunny graveyard of Dorking village. Looking down toward it from the long level summit of Box Hill, his hill, with the sunlight glinting from its marbles and along the silver mole that winds thread-like beside it, the little cemetery seems almost a living cheerful thing in the dark green of the surrounding landscape. Surely here, if anywhere, was appropriate resting place for this great lover of life and joy. The tribute to Meredith contained in the following pages, perhaps the most fitting and beautiful of any inspired by his death, was originally published in the London Westminster Gazette for May 26, 1909. Neither Dorking nor the Abbey. All morning there had been a little gathering of people outside the gate. The funeral coach came, and a very small thing was placed in it, covered with flowers. One plant of the wallflower in the garden would have covered it. The coach took the road to Dorking, followed by a few others, and in a moment or two all seemed silent and deserted, the cottage, the garden, and Box Hill. The cottage was not deserted, as they knew who now trooped into the round in front of it, their eyes on the closed door. They were the mighty company, his children, Lucy and Clara and Rhoda and Diana and Rose and old Mel and Roy Richmond and Adrian and Sir Willoughby and 100 others, and they stood in line against the boxwood waiting for him to come out. Each of his women carried a flower, and the hands of all his men were ready for the salute. In the room on the right, in an armchair which had been his home for years, to many the throne of letters in this country, sat an old man, like one forgotten in an empty house. When the last sound of the coaches had passed away, he moved in his chair. He wore grey clothes and a red tie, and his face was rarely beautiful. But his hair was white, and the limbs were feeble, and the wonderful eyes dimmed, and he was hard of hearing. He moved in his chair, for something was happening to him, and it was this: old age was falling from him. This is what is meant by death to such as he, and the company waiting knew. His eyes became again those of the eagle, and his hair was brown, and the lustiness of youth was in his frame, but still he wore the red tie. He rose, and not a moment did he remain within the house, for golden lie the meadows, golden run the streams, and the fields and the waters shout to him golden shouts. He flung open the door, as they knew he would do who were awaiting him, and he stood there looking at them, a general reviewing his troops. They wore the pretty clothing in which he had loved to drape them. They were not sad like the mourners who had gone, but happy as the forget-me-nots and pansies at their feet and the lilac overhead, for they knew that this was his coronation day. Only one was airily in mourning, as knowing better than the others what fitted the occasion, the Countess de Saldar. He recognized her sense of the fitness of things with a bow. The men saluted. The women gave their flowers to Delia to give to him, so that she should have his last word, and he took their offerings and passed on. They did not go with him. they went their ways to carry his glory through the world. Without knowing why, for his work was done, he turned to the left, passing his famous cherry blossom, and climbed between apple trees to a little house of 2 rooms, whence most of that noble company had sprung. He went there only because he had gone so often, and this time the door was locked. He did not know why, nor care. He came swinging down the path, singing lustily and calling to his dogs of the present and the past, and they yelped with joy, for they knew they were once again to breast the hill with him. He strode up the hill, whirling his staff, for which he had no longer any other use. His hearing was again so acute that from far away on the Dorking road he could hear the rumbling of the coach. There came to him somehow a knowledge, it was the last he ever knew of little things, that people had been at variance as to whether a casket of dust should be laid away in one hole or in another, and he flung back his head with the old glorious action, and laughed a laugh, broad as 1,000 beeves at pasture. Box Hill was no longer deserted. When a great man dies, and this was one of the greatest since Shakespeare, the immortals await him at the top of the nearest hill. He looked up and saw his peers. They were all young, like himself. He waved the staff in greeting. One, a mere stripling, slight unspeakably, detached himself from the others, crying gloriously as he recognized his master. "Here's the fellow I have been telling you about," and ran down the hill to be the first to take his hand. In the meantime, an empty coach was rolling on to Dorking. G.M. 1828 to 1909. 40 years back, when much had place that since has perished out of mind, I heard that voice and saw that face. He spoke as one afoot will wind a morning horn ere men awake. His note was trenchant, turning kind. He was one of those whose wit can shake and riddle to the very core the counterfeits that time will break. Of late, when we two met once more, the luminous countenance and rare shone just as 40 years before, so that, when now all tongues declare his shape unseen by his green hill, I scarce believe he sits not there. No matter, further and further still, through the world's vaporous vitiate air, his words wing on, as live words will. Thomas Hardy, May 1909. End of Neither Dorking Nor the Abbey, by J. M. Barrie.
Description of a Grain of Wheat by Mrs. E. E. Kellogg. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wheat is the most important of the grain foods. It is probably a native of southwestern Asia, though like most grains cultivated from the earliest periods, its history is extremely obscure. Wheat is of 2 principal kinds, characterized as soft and hard wheat, though there are hundreds of named varieties of the grain. The distinction between many of these is due to variation in the relative proportions of starch and nitrogenous matter. Some contain not more than 8% of nitrogenous elements, while others contain 18 or 20%, with a corresponding decrease in carbonaceous elements. The difference depends upon the soil, cultivation, season, climate, and other conditions under which the grain is produced. The structure of the wheat grain consists of an external tegument of hard, woody nature, so coherent that it appears in the form of scales or bran when the wheat is ground, and an inner portion, more soft and friable, consisting of several cellular layers. The layer nearest the outer husk contains vegetable fibrin and fatty matter. The second layer is largely composed of gluten cells, while the centre, comprising the bulk of the grain, is chiefly made up of starch granules with a small proportion of gluten. The structure of a wheat kernel is well illustrated in the accompanying cut. As will be seen, the different food elements are situated in different parts of the grain, and not uniformly distributed throughout its structure. The outer husk of the berry is composed wholly of innutritious and indigestible matter, but the thin layers which lie next to this outer covering contain the larger proportion of the nitrogenous elements to be found in the entire kernel. The central portion consists almost wholly of farinaceous matter. Phosphates and other mineral matter are present to some extent throughout the entire grain, but preponderates in the external part. Here is also found a peculiar, soluble, active principle called diastase, which possesses the power of converting starch into sugar. The dark colour and marked flavour of graham bread is undoubtedly due to the influence of this element. Until within a few years, the unground grain was rarely used as an article of food, but people are beginning to appreciate its wholesomeness, and cracked, rolled and pearled wheats are coming rapidly into favour. Cracked wheat is the grain cleaned and then cut into 2 or more pieces. In rolled wheat, the grains are mashed between rollers, by which process they are thoroughly softened in every part, and are then easily cooked. Pearl wheat is the whole grain, cleaned and dressed. The whole grain is also cooked sometimes in its natural state. End of Description of a Grain of Wheat by Mrs. E. E. Kellogg. Read for LibriVox.org by Melanie T.
Panegyric on Abraham by Soren Kierkegaard. From Fear and Trembling, published in 1843. Translated by Lee M. Hollander in 1923. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Panegyric on Abraham. If a consciousness of the eternal were not implanted in man, if the basis of all that exists were but a confusedly fermenting element which, convulsed by obscure passions, produced all, both the great and the insignificant, if under everything there lay a bottomless void never to be filled, what else were life but despair? If it were thus, and if there were no sacred bonds between man and man, if one generation arose after another, as in the forest the leaves of one season succeed the leaves of another, or like the songs of birds which are taken up one after another. If the generations of man passed through the world like a ship passing through the sea, and the wind over the desert, a fruitless and vain thing, if eternal oblivion were ever greedily watching for its prey, and there existed no power strong enough to wrest it from its clutches, how empty were life then, and how dismal! And therefore it is not thus, but just as God created man and woman, he likewise called into being the hero and the poet or orator. The latter cannot perform the deeds of the hero, he can only admire and love him and rejoice in him. And yet he also is happy, and not less so, for the hero is, as it were, his better self, with which he has fallen in love, and he is glad he is not himself the hero, so that his love can express itself in admiration. The poet is the genius of memory, and does nothing but recall what has been done, can do nothing but admire what has been done. He adds nothing of his own, but he is jealous of what has been entrusted to him. He obeys the choice of his own heart, but once he has found what he has been seeking, he visits every man's door with his song and with his speech, so that all may admire the hero as he does, and be proud of the hero as he is. This is his achievement, his humble work, This is his faithful service in the house of the hero. If thus faithful to his love, he battles day and night against the guile of oblivion, which wishes to lure the hero from him, then has he accomplished his task. Then is he gathered to his hero who loves him as faithfully. For the poet is as it were the hero's better self, unsubstantial, to be sure, like a mere memory, but also transfigured as is a memory. Therefore shall no one be forgotten who has done great deeds, and even if there be delay, even if the cloud of misunderstanding obscure the hero from our vision, still his lover will come sometime, and the more time has passed, the more faithfully will he cleave to him. No one shall be forgotten who was great in the world, but each hero was great in his own way, and each one was eminent in proportion to the great things he loved. For he who loved himself became great through himself, and he who loved others became great through his devotion. But he who loved God became greater than all of these. Every one of them shall be remembered, but each one became great in proportion to his trust. One became great by hoping for the possible, another by hoping for the eternal. But he who hoped for the impossible, he became greater than all of these. Every one shall be remembered, but each one was great in proportion to the power with which he strove. For he who strove with the world became great by overcoming himself, but he who strove with God, he became the greatest of them all. Thus there have been struggles in the world, man against man, one against 1,000. But he who struggles with God, he became greatest of them all. Thus there was fighting on this earth, and there was he who conquered everything by his strength, and there was he who conquered God by his weakness. There was he who, trusting in himself, gained all, and there was he who, trusting in his strength, sacrificed everything. But he who believed in God was greater than all of these. There was he who was great through his strength, and he who was great through his wisdom, and he who was great through his hopes, and he who was great through his love. But Abraham was greater than all of these. Great through the strength whose power is weakness, great through the wisdom whose secret is folly, great through the hope whose expression is madness, great through the love which is hatred of oneself. Through the urging of his faith, Abraham left the land of his forefathers and became a stranger in the land of promise. He left one thing behind and took one thing along. He left his worldly wisdom behind and took with him faith. For else he would not have left the land of his fathers, but would have thought it an unreasonable demand. Through his faith he came to be a stranger in the land of promise, where there was nothing to remind him of all that had been dear to him, but where everything by its newness tempted his soul to longing. And yet was he God's chosen, he in whom the Lord was well pleased? Indeed, had he been one cast off, one thrust out of God's mercy, then might he have comprehended it. But now it seemed like a mockery of him and of his faith. There had been others who lived in exile from the fatherland which they loved. They are not forgotten, nor is a song of lament forgotten in which they mournfully sought and found what they had lost. Of Abraham there exists no song of lamentation. It is human to complain, it is human to weep with the weeping, but it is greater to believe, and more blessed to consider him who has faith. Through his faith Abraham received the promise that in his seed were to be blessed all races of mankind. Time passed, there was still the possibility of it, and Abraham had faith. Another man there was who also lived in hopes. Time passed. The evening of his life was approaching. Neither was he paltry enough to have forgotten his hopes, neither shall he be forgotten by us. Then he sorrowed, and his sorrow did not deceive him, as life had done, but gave him all it could. For in the sweetness of sorrow he became possessed of his disappointed hopes. It is human to sorrow, it is human to sorrow with the sorrowing, but it is greater to have faith, and more blessed to consider him who has faith. No song of lamentation has come down to us from Abraham. He did not sadly count the days as time passed. He did not look at Sarah with suspicious eyes, whether she was becoming old. He did not stop the sun's course, lest Sarah should grow old, and his hope with her. He did not lull her with his songs of lamentation. Abraham grew old, and Sarah became a laughingstock to the people. And yet was he God's chosen, and heir to the promise that in his seed were to be blessed all races of mankind. Were it, then, not better if he had not been God's chosen? For what is it to be God's chosen? Is it to have denied to one in one's youth all the wishes of youth, in order to have them fulfilled after great labor in old age? But Abraham had faith and steadfastly lived in hope. Had Abraham been less firm in his trust, then would he have given up that hope. He would have said to God, "So it is, perchance, not thy will after all that this shall come to pass. I shall surrender my hope. It was my only one. It was my bliss. I am sincere. I conceal no secret grudge, for that thou didst deny it to me." He would not have remained forgotten. His example would have saved many a one, but he would not have become the father of faith. For it is great to surrender one's hope, but greater still to abide by it steadfastly after having surrendered it. For it is great to seize hold of the eternal hope, but greater still to abide steadfastly by one's worldly hopes after having surrendered them. Then came the fullness of time. If Abraham had not had faith, then Sarah would probably have died of sorrow, and Abraham, dulled by his grief, would not have understood the fulfillment, but would have smiled about it as a dream of his youth. But Abraham had faith, and therefore he remained young. For he who always hopes for the best, him life will deceive, and he will grow old. And he who is always prepared for the worst, he will soon age. But he who has faith, he will preserve eternal youth. Praise therefore be to this story. For Sarah, though advanced in age, was young enough to wish for the pleasures of a mother, and Abraham, though gray of hair, was young enough to wish to become a father. In a superficial sense it may be considered miraculous that what they wished for came to pass. But in a deeper sense the miracle of faith is to be seen in Abraham's and Sarah's being young enough to wish, and their faith having preserved their wish and therewith their youth. The promise he had received was fulfilled, and he accepted it in faith, and it came to pass according to the promise of his faith. Whereas Moses smote the rock with his staff, but believed not. There was joy in Abraham's house when Sarah celebrated the day of her golden wedding. But it was not to remain thus, for once more was Abraham to be tempted. He had struggled with that cunning power to which nothing is impossible, with that ever watchful enemy who never sleeps, with that old man who outlives all. He had struggled with time, and had preserved his faith. And now all the terror of that fight was concentrated in one moment. And God tempted Abraham, saying to him, "Take now thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of." All was lost then, and more terribly than if a son had never been given him. The Lord had only mocked Abraham then. Miraculously he had realized the unreasonable hopes of Abraham, and now he wished to take away what he had given. A foolish hope it had been, but Abraham had not laughed when the promise had been made him. Now all was lost. The trusting hope of 70 years, the brief joy at the fulfillment of his hopes. Who then is he that snatches away the old man's staff? Who that demands that he himself shall break it in two? Who is he that renders disconsolate the gray hair of old age? Who is he that demands that he himself shall do it? Is there no pity for the venerable old man, and none for the innocent child? And yet was Abraham God's chosen one, and yet was it the Lord that tempted him. And now all was to be lost. The glorious remembrance of him by a whole race, the promise of Abraham's seed, all that was but a whim, a passing fancy of the Lord, which Abraham was now to destroy forever. That glorious treasure, as old as the faith in Abraham's heart, and many, many years older than Isaac, the fruit of Abraham's life, sanctified by prayers, matured in struggles, the blessing on the lips of Abraham. This fruit was now to be plucked before the appointed time, and to remain without significance. For of what significance were it if Isaac was to be sacrificed? That sad and yet blessed hour when Abraham was to take leave from all that was dear to him, the hour when he would once more lift up his venerable head, when his face would shine like the countenance of the Lord, the hour when he would collect his whole soul for a blessing strong enough to render Isaac blessed all the days of his life, that hour was not to come. He was to say farewell to Isaac, to be sure, but in such wise that he himself was to remain behind. Death was to part them, but in such wise that Isaac was to die. The old man was not in happiness to lay his hand on Isaac's head when the hour of death came, but, tired of life, to lay violent hands on Isaac. And it was God who tempted him. Woe, woe to the messenger who would have come before Abraham with such a command! Who would have dared to be the messenger of such dread tidings? But it was God that tempted Abraham. But Abraham had faith, and had faith for this life. Indeed, had his faith been but concerning the life to come, then might he more easily have cast away all, in order to hasten out of this world which was not his. But Abraham had faith, and doubted not, but trusted that the improbable would come to pass. If Abraham had doubted, then would he have undertaken something else, something great and noble. For what could Abraham have undertaken but was great and noble? He would have proceeded to Mount Moriah. He would have cloven the wood, and fired it, and unsheathed his knife. He would have cried out to God, "Despise not this sacrifice. It is not indeed the best I have, for what is an old man against a child foretold of God? But it is the best I can give thee. Let Isaac never know that he must find consolation in his youth." He would have plunged the steel in his own breast, and he would have been admired throughout the world, and his name would not have been forgotten. But it is one thing to be admired, and another to be a lodestar which guides one troubled in mind. But Abraham had faith. He prayed not for mercy, and that he might prevail upon the Lord. It was only when just retribution was to be visited upon Sodom and Gomorrah that Abraham ventured to beseech him for mercy. We read in Scripture, "And God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am." You, whom I am now addressing, did you do likewise? When you saw the dire dispensations of Providence approach threateningly, did you not then say to the mountains, "Fall on me," and to the hills, "Cover me"? Or, if you were stronger in faith, did not your step linger along the way, longing for the old accustomed paths, as it were? And when the voice called you, did you answer then, or not at all? And if you did, perchance in a low voice, or whispering? Not thus Abraham, but gladly and cheerfully and trustingly, and with a resonant voice he made answer, Here am I. And we read further, And Abraham rose up early in the morning. He made haste as though for some joyous occasion, and early in the morning he was in the appointed place on Mount Moriah. He said nothing to Sarah, nothing to Eliezer, his steward, for who would have understood him? Did not his temptation by its very nature demand of him the vow of silence? He laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. My listener, many a father there have been who thought that with his child he lost the dearest of all there was in the world for him. Yet assuredly no child ever was in that sense a pledge of God, as was Isaac to Abraham. Many a father there has been who lost his child, but then it was God, the unchangeable and inscrutable will of the Almighty, and his hand which took it. Thus not with Abraham. For him was reserved a more severe trial, and Isaac's fate was put into Abraham's hand together with the knife. And there he stood, the old man, with his only hope. Yet he did not doubt, nor look anxiously to the left or right, nor challenge heaven with his prayers. He knew it was God the Almighty who now put him to the test. He knew it was the greatest sacrifice which could be demanded of him. But he knew also that no sacrifice was too great which God demanded. And he drew forth his knife. Who strengthened Abraham's arm? Who supported his right arm that it drooped not powerless? For he who contemplates this scene is unnerved. Who strengthened Abraham's soul so that his eyes grew not too dim to see either Isaac or the ram? For he who contemplates this scene will be struck with blindness. And yet it is rare enough that one is unnerved or is struck with blindness, and still more rare that one narrates worthily what there did take place between father and son. To be sure, we know well enough. It was but a trial. If Abraham had doubted when standing on Mount Moriah, if he had looked about him in perplexity, if he had accidentally discovered the ram before drawing the knife, if God had permitted him to sacrifice it instead of Isaac, then would he have returned home, and all would have been as before. He would have had Sarah, and he would have kept Isaac. And yet how different all would have been! For then had his return been a flight, his salvation an accident, his reward disgrace, his future perchance perdition. Then would he have borne witness neither to his faith nor to God's mercy, but would have witnessed only to the terror of going to Mount Moriah. Then Abraham would not have been forgotten, nor either Mount Moriah. It would be mentioned then, not as is Mount Ararat, on which the ark landed, but as a sign of terror, because it was there Abraham doubted. Venerable Patriarch Abraham, when you returned home from Mount Moriah, you required no encomiums to console you for what you had lost, for indeed you did win all, and still kept Isaac, as we all know. And the Lord did no more take him from your side, but you sat gladly at table with him in your tent, as in the life to come you will, for all times. Venerable Patriarch Abraham, thousands of years have passed since those times, but still you need no late-born lover to snatch your memory from the power of oblivion, for every language remembers you. And yet do you reward your lover more gloriously than any one, rendering him blessed in your bosom, and taking heart and eyes captive by the marvel of your deed. venerable patriarch Abraham, second father of the race. You who first perceived and bore witness to that unbounded passion which was but scorn for the terrible fight with the raging elements and the strength of brute creation, in order to struggle with God. You who first felt that sublimest of all passions, you who found the holy, pure, humble expression for the divine madness which was a marvel to the heathen, forgive him who would speak in your praise, in case he did it not fittingly. He spoke humbly, as if it concerned the desire of his heart. He spoke briefly, as is seemly, but he will never forget that you required 100 years to obtain a son of your old age, against all expectations, that you had to draw the knife before being permitted to keep Isaac. He will never forget that in 130 years you never got farther than to faith. End of Panegyric on Abraham by Søren Kierkegaard, From Fear and Trembling, published in 1843, translated by Lee M. Hollander in 1923.
Speeches and Letters of Abraham Lincoln, 1832-1865, edited by Merwin Rowe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Proclamation for a Day of Thanksgiving, October 3, 1863, by Abraham Lincoln. The year that is drawing toward its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which were so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and provoke their aggressions, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere, except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. Needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines, as well of iron and coal as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy. It has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and one voice by the whole American people. I do, therefore, invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea, and those sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of thanksgiving, and praise to our beneficent Father, who dwelleth in the heavens. And I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to him for such singular deliverances and blessings, they do also with humble penitence for our national perverseness and disobedience, Commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife in which we are unavoidably engaged, and fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation, and to restore it, as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes, to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. End of Proclamation for a Day of Thanksgiving, October 3, 1863, by Abraham Lincoln.
The Shrine of St. Edmund by Jocelyn of Brakelond. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the year of grace 1198, the glorious martyr Edmund was pleased to strike terror into our convent, and to instruct us that his body should be kept more reverently and diligently than it had hereto been. There was a wooden platform between the shrine and the high altar, whereon stood 2 tapers, which the keepers of the shrine used to renew and stick together, by placing one candle upon the stump of another in a slovenly manner. Under this platform there were many things irreverently huddled together, such as flax and thread and wax and various utensils. In fact, whatever was used by the keepers of the shrine was put there, for there was a door with iron gratings. Now, when the keepers of the shrine were fast asleep on the night of St. Elfildra, part of a candle that had been renewed and was still burning fell, as we conjecture, upon the aforesaid platform covered with rags. Consequently, all that was near, above, or below began to burn rapidly, so much so that the iron gratings were at a white heat. And lo, the wrath of the Lord was kindled, but not without mercy, according to the saying, in wrath remember mercy. For just then the clock struck before the hour of matins, and the master of the vestry, getting up, observed and noticed the fire. He ran at once, and, striking the gong as if for a dead person, cried at the top of his voice that the shrine was consumed by fire. We then, all running thither, found the fire raging wonderfully, and encircling the whole shrine, and almost reaching the woodwork of the church. Our young men, running for water, some to the well, some to the clock, some with their hoods, not without great labour, extinguished the force of the fire, and also stripped some of the altars upon the first alarm. And when cold water was poured upon the front of the shrine, the stones fell, and were reduced almost to powder. Moreover, the nails, by which the plates of silver were affixed to the shrine, started from the wood, which had been burnt underneath to the thickness of my finger, and the plates of silver were left dangling one from the other without nails. However, the golden image of the Majesty in front of the shrine, together with some of the stonework, remained firm and untouched, and brighter after the fire than it was before, for it was all of gold. It so happened, by the will of the Highest, that at the time the great beam which used to be over the altar had been removed, in order to be adorned with new carving. It also happened that the cross, the small image of St. Mary and St. John, the chest with the shirt of St. Edmund, and the reliquaries and other shrines which used to hang from the same beam, and other holy things which also stood upon the beam, had every one of them been previously taken away. Otherwise all these would have been burnt, as we believe, even as a painted cloth was burnt which hung in the place of this beam. But what would it have been had the church been curtained? When, therefore, we had assured ourselves that the fire had in no place penetrated the shrine, by carefully inspecting the chinks and crannies, if there were any, and had perceived that all was cold, our grief in a great measure abated. But all at once some of our brethren cried out with a great wailing that the cup of St. Edmund had been burnt, and when many of us were searching here and there for the stones and plates among the coals and cinders, they drew forth the cup entirely uninjured, lying in the middle of the great charred timbers, which were then put out, and found the same wrapped up in linen cloth, half burnt. But the oaken box in which the cup was usually placed had been burnt to ashes, and only the iron bands and iron lock were found. When we saw this miracle, we all wept for joy. Now, as we observed that the greater part of the front of the shrine was stripped off, and abhorring the disgraceful circumstances of the fire, after a general consultation we sent for a goldsmith, and caused the metal plates to be joined together and fixed to the shrine without the least delay, to avoid the scandal of the matter. We also caused all traces of the fire to be covered over with wax, or in some other way. But the evangelist testifies that there is nothing covered which shall not be revealed. For some pilgrims came very early in the morning to make their offerings, who could have perceived nothing of the sort. Nevertheless, certain of them, peering about, inquired where was the fire that they had heard had been about the shrine. And since it could not be entirely concealed, it was answered to those inquirers that a candle had fallen down, and that 3 napkins had been burnt, and that by the heat of the fire some of the stonework in front of the shrine had been destroyed. Yet for all this there went forth a lying rumour that the head of the saint had been burnt. Some indeed contented themselves with saying that the hair only was singed, but afterwards, the truth being known, the mouth of them that spake the lies was stopped. All these things came to pass by God's providence, in order that the places round about the shrine of his saint should be more decently kept, and that the purpose of the Lord Abbot should be sooner and without delay carried into execution, which was, that the shrine itself, together with the body of the holy martyr, should be placed with greater security and with more pomp in a more dignified position. For, before this aforesaid mishap occurred, the cresting of the shrine was half finished, and the marble blocks whereon the shrine was to be elevated and was to rest were for the most part ready and polished. The abbot, who at this time was absent, was exceedingly grieved at these reports, and he on his return home, going into the chapter house, declared that these and the like, nay, much greater perils might befall us for our sins, more especially for our grumbling about our meat and drink, in a certain measure turning the blame upon the whole body of the convent rather than upon the avarice and carelessness of the keepers of the shrine, to the intent that he might induce us to abstain from our pittances for at least 1 year, and to apply for at least 1 year the rents of the pittancy, for the purpose of repairing the front of the shrine with pure gold. He himself first showed us an example of the liberality by giving all the treasure of gold he possessed, namely 15 gold rings worth, as it was believed 60 marks, in our presence, towards the reparation of the shrine. We, on the other hand, all agreed to give our pittancy for such purpose, but our resolution was afterwards altered by the sacrist saying that St. Edmund's could very well repair his shrine without such assistance. At this time there came a man of great account, but who he was I know not, that related to the abbot a vision he had seen, whereat he himself was much moved. Indeed, he related the same in full chapter, with a very bitter speech. It is indeed true, he said, that a certain great man has seen a vision, to wit, that he saw the holy martyr St. Edmund lie outside his shrine, and with groans say that he was despoiled of his clothes, and was wasted away by hunger and thirst, and that his churchyard and the courts of his church were negligently kept. The dream the abbot expounded to us all publicly, laying the blame upon us in this fashion: St. Edmund alleges that he is naked, because you defraud the naked poor of your old clothes, and because you give with reluctance what you are bound to give them. And it is the same with your meat and drink. Moreover, the idleness and negligence of the sacrist and his associates are apparent from the recent misfortune by fire which has taken place between the shrine and the altar." On hearing this, the convent was very sorrowful, and after chapter several of the brethren met together and interpreted the dream after this fashion. "We," they said, "are the naked members of St. Edmund, and the convent is his naked body, for we are despoiled of our ancient customs and privileges. The abbot has everything, the chamberlainship, the sacristy, the cellary, while we perish of hunger and thirst, because we have not had our victuals, save by the clerk of the abbot and by his ministration. If the keepers of the shrine have been negligent, let the abbot lay it to his own charge, for it was he who appointed such careless fellows." In such wise spoke many in the convent. But when this interpretation of the dream was communicated to the abbot, in the forest of Harlow, on his way from London, he was very wroth, and was troubled in mind, and made answer, "They will wrest that dream against me, will they? By the face of God! So soon as I reach home, I will restore them the customs that they say are theirs. I will withdraw my clerk from the cellary, and will leave them to themselves, and I shall see the fruits of their wisdom at the end of the year. This year I have been residing at home, and I have caused their cellary to be managed without incurring debt, and this is the way in which they render me thanks." On the abbot's return home, having it in purpose to translate the blessed martyr, he humbled himself before God and man, meditating within himself on how he might reform himself, and make himself at peace with all men, especially with his own convent. Therefore, sitting in chapter, he commanded that a cellarer and a sub-cellarer should be chosen by our common assent, and withdrew his own clerk, saying that whatsoever he had done it for our advantage, as he called God and his saints to witness, and justified himself in various ways. "Hear, O heaven, the things I speak. Give ear, O earth, to what Abbot Samson did. The feast of St. Edmund now approaching, the marble blocks were polished, and everything made ready for the elevation of the shrine. The feast day having therefore been kept on a Friday, a 3 days' fast was proclaimed on the following Sunday to the people, and the occasion of the fast was publicly explained. The abbot also announced to the convent that they should prepare themselves for transferring the shrine, and placing it upon the high altar, until the mason's work was finished, and he appointed the time and the manner for doing this work. When we had that night come to matins, there stood the great shrine upon the altar, empty within, adorned with white doe-skins above, below, and round about, which were fixed to the wood by silver nails. But one panel stood below, by a column of the church, and the sacred body still lay in its accustomed place. Lauds having been sung, we all proceeded to take our disciplines. This being performed, the Lord Abbot and those with him vested themselves in albs, and approaching reverently, as it was fit they should, they hastened to uncover the coffin. First there was an outer cloth of linen, overwrapping the coffin and all. This was found tied on the upper side with strings of its own. Within this was a cloth of silk, and then another of linen cloth, and then a third. And so at last the coffin was uncovered, standing upon a tray of wood, that the bottom of it might not be injured by the stone. Affixed to the outside, over the breast of the martyr, lay an angel of gold, about the length of a man's foot, holding in one hand a golden sword, and in the other a banner. Underneath it there was a hole in the lid of the coffin, where the ancient custodians of the martyr had been wont to lay their hands for the purpose of touching the sacred body, and over the figure of the angel was this verse inscribed: Matrius ecce zoma servant Michaelis angelma. Behold the martyr's body St. Michael's image keeps. At the two heads of the coffin were iron rings, as there used to be on Danish chests. So raising up the coffin with the body, they carried it to the altar, and I lent thereto my sinful hand to help in carrying it, although the abbot had strictly commanded that no one should approach unless he was called. The coffin was placed within the shrine, and the panel was put thereon and fastened down. Now we all began to think that the abbot would exhibit the coffin to the people on the octave of the feast, and would replace the sacred body before all of us. But we were sadly deceived, as the sequel will show, for on Wednesday, while the convent was singing Compline, the abbot spoke with the sacrist and Walter the physician, and it was resolved that 12 brethren should be appointed, who were strong enough to carry the panels of the shrine, and skilful in fixing and unfixing them. The abbot then said that it had been the object of his prayers to see his patron saint, and that he wished to join with him, the sacrist and Walter the physician, when he looked upon him. And there were also nominated the abbot's 2 chaplains, the 2 keepers of the shrine, and the 2 keepers of the vestry, with 6 others: Hugh the sacrist, Walter the physician, Augustine, William of Dis, Robert, and Richard. The convent being all asleep, these 12 vested themselves in albs, and drawing the coffin out of the shrine, carried and placed it upon a table near where the shrine used to be, and commenced unfastening the lid, which was joined and fixed to the coffin with 16 very long iron nails. When, with considerable difficulty, they had performed this, all were ordered to go further away, except the 2 forenamed associates. Now the coffin was so filled with the sacred body, both in length and width, that even a needle could hardly be put between the head and the wood, or between the feet and the wood. The head lay united to the body, somewhat raised by a small pillow. The abbot, looking attentively, next found a silk cloth veiling the whole body, and then a linen cloth of wondrous whiteness, and upon the head a small linen cloth, and after that another small and very fine silken cloth, as if it had been the veil of some nun. Lastly, they discovered the body wound round with a linen cloth, and then it was that all the lineaments of the saint's body were laid open to view. At this point the abbot stopped, saying he durst not proceed further, or view the holy body naked. Taking the head between his hands, he sighed and spoke thus: "Glorious martyr, St. Edmund, blessed be the hour wherein thou wast born. Glorious martyr, turn not my boldness to perdition, for that I, miserable sinner, do touch thee, for thou knowest my devotion and my intention." And proceeding, he touched the eyes and the nose, which was very massive and prominent. Then he touched the breast and arms, and raising the left arm, he touched the fingers, and placed his own fingers between the fingers of the saint. Proceeding further, he found the feet standing stiff up, like the feet of a man who had died that day, and he touched the toes, in touching counting them. It was then proposed that the other brethren should be called forward, in order that they might see these wonders, and 6 being thus called approached, and also 6 other brethren with them, who had stolen in without the abbot's assent, and saw the saint's body, namely Walter of St. Albans, Hugh the infirmary, Gilbert, brother of the prior, Richard of Hinging, Jussel the cellarer, and Thurston the little, who alone put forth his hand and touched the feet and knees of the saint, and the Most High so ordering it, that there might be abundance of witnesses, one of our brethren, John of Dis, sitting upon the roof of the church with the servants of the vestry, saw all these things plainly enough. All this being done, the lid was fastened down on the coffin with the same number of nails, and in like manner as before, the martyr being covered up with the same cloths, and in the same order as he was when first discovered. Finally, the coffin was placed in the accustomed place, where there was put upon the coffin, near to the angel, a certain silken bag, wherein was deposited a schedule written in English, containing certain salutations of Alwyn the monk, as is believed, which schedule was found close by the golden angel when the coffin was uncovered. By the abbot's order, there was forthwith written another short memorandum, also deposited in the same bag, in the following form of words: In the year of the incarnation of our Lord, 1198, the Abbot Samson, upon the impulse of devotion, saw and touched the body of St. Edmund, on the night after the feast of St. Catherine, these being witnesses, and thereto were subscribed the names of the 18 monks. The brethren also wound the whole coffin up in a suitable linen cloth, and over the same placed a new and valuable silken cloth, which Hubert, Archbishop of Canterbury, had offered at the shrine that very year, and they placed lengthwise a certain linen cloth doubled under it and next to the stone, to prevent the coffin or the tray whereon it stood from being injured by the stone. Afterwards the panels were brought forth and properly joined together on the shrine. When the convent assembled to sing matins, and understood what had been done, all those who had not seen these things were very sorrowful, saying among themselves, "We have been sadly deceived." However, after matins had been sung, the abbot called the convent to the high altar, and briefly recounting what had been done, alleged that he ought not to call, and could not call, all of them to be present on such occasion. Hearing this, with tears we sang Te Deum Laudamus, and hastened to ring the bells in the choir. On the 4th day after, the abbot deposed the keepers of the shrine and the keeper of St. Botolph, appointing new ones, and establishing rules so that the holy places should be more carefully and diligently kept. He also caused the great altar, which heretofore was hollow, and wherein many things were irreverently stowed away, and that space which was between the shrine and the altar, to be made solid with stone and cement, so that no danger from the fire could arise by the negligence of the keepers, as had already been the case, according to the saying of the wise man, who said, "Happy is he who learns caution from the danger of others." End of The Shrine of St. Edmund by Jocelyn of Brakeland. Read for LibriVox.org by Melanie T.